She was one of the Air Force's brightest young pilots. But in 1949, she vanished mid-flight without a single distress call. 50 years later, when her crashed jet was found in the desert, what lay inside changed everything her family thought they knew. The sun over the Mojave Desert was still low enough to cast long, sharp shadows across the cracked runway. The air was cold, thin, and so still you could hear the clink of metal tools from the far end of the hangar row. On the tarmac outside Hangar 12, Captain Ellie Reeves stood beside a silver jet prototype that still smelled of fresh paint and aviation fuel. At 29, she was already a rarity, a woman test pilot in the U.S. Air Force's fledgling jet program. Her appointment had made the papers, but most of her work was buried under a shroud of research flight classifications. She had flown experimental designs that never left the drawing board, evaluated engines that existed only in single prototypes, and pushed aircraft to their limits so engineers could find the breaking point before the enemy did. That morning, January 17, 1949. The ground crew noticed something different in her demeanor. She wasn't humming under her breath, as she often did before climbing into the cockpit. She was quiet, scanning the perimeter more than the plane. The chief mechanic, Sergeant Morris, approached, holding the pre-flight clipboard. "We've checked everything twice, ma'am. She's ready." Ellie's gloved hand lingered on the metal fuselage. "Where's Major Harland?" she asked. Harland was the base operations officer and the man who'd handed her sealed flight orders the night before. "In his office. Said he'll be out after you're in the air," Morris replied. That was unusual. Harland normally oversaw every takeoff for classified test flights. Ellie climbed into the cockpit, strapping herself in with the practiced efficiency of hundreds of sorties. The sealed envelope sat in the side compartment where she'd left it, unopened. Officially, the flight was a high-altitude performance test. Unofficially, no one asked questions if they wanted to keep their clearance. The control tower cleared her for takeoff at 7:43. The jet's engines roared to life, scattering the desert silence. Morris gave her a thumbs up, and she taxied to the end of the runway. Her last radio transmission was calm and clipped. "Control, this is Bluebird 1. Rolling. The aircraft accelerated, lifting into the pale sky. The tower tracked her climb on radar until, 17 minutes later, the blip disappeared. No distress call, no wreckage spotted. Just gone. Within an hour, military police sealed off the base perimeter. Flight logs were collected. The tower crew was told to file new reports omitting certain details: the exact altitude, the heading, the range. And by sundown, an official press release described mechanical failure during a MICE test flight and no expectation of survival. For her family, the news came in the form of a telegram delivered to her mother's porch in San Diego. "Regret to inform you that Captain Ellie Reeves is missing in the line of duty. Presumed deceased. Details classified." No remains, no crash site, no memorial service beyond a folded flag and a photograph. And for 50 years, that was the end of it. Until one spring morning in 1999, when a group of amateur prospectors combing an off-limits stretch of desert stumbled on the jagged outline of aluminum under the sand, a silver fuselage, twisted but unmistakable, with faded USAF markings and the tail number that had last lifted from the Mojave runway on January 17, 1949. Inside the shattered cockpit, under a crust of dust and time, they found something no one expected, something that would pull an old disappearance out of the archives and into the center of a fight the Air Force never wanted to have. The coordinates weren't even on a standard map. A pale line on the satellite view marked a disused mining trail, the kind you'd only find if you knew exactly where to look. Sergeant Daniel Reeves, retired Air Force, now 53, squinted at the printout spread across his kitchen table in Tucson. The tail number in the grainy photograph made his throat tighten. It was the same one he'd memorized as a boy from the only surviving image of his Aunt Ellie standing beside her jet. The phone call had come 2 nights earlier from a man named Carlos Mendieta, a prospector who'd been out hunting for old gold claims in the desert. Carlos had recognized the faded star and bar insignia and jotted down the numbers on the tail before reporting it to the Bureau of Land Management. One of the BLM rangers, an old friend of Daniel's, had called him before the site was locked down. "They'll shut this off fast," the ranger had said. "If you want to see it, come now." By dawn, Daniel was driving west into a part of Arizona where even the highway signs looked sun-bleached to the bone. The road ended in sand ruts, and then it was another 2 miles on foot, guided by GPS and the shimmer of heat rising off the desert. The wreckage was half buried in a shallow arroyo, as if the desert had been slowly swallowing it for decades. The nose was crumpled deep into the earth, the canopy cracked but intact, its glass weathered to a dull amber. Daniel crouched beside the fuselage, running his fingers over the pitted aluminum. The paint had flaked away, but the letters USAIR FORCE were still faintly visible. And there, just ahead of the tail, was the number 0849-B, Ellie's jet. A wind gust shifted the sand at the base of the cockpit, revealing something dark wedged under a seat strut. Daniel brushed it off and froze. It was a leather-bound notebook, its cover stiff with age but intact, edges sealed with what looked like wax, and an official Air Force property stamp on the front. He glanced over his shoulder. The BLM team hadn't arrived yet. Whatever this was, if it stayed here, it would disappear into an evidence locker and never surface again. He slipped the notebook into his pack. An hour later, a pair of white SUVs rolled up in a plume of dust. 2 men in khaki stepped out, not BLM Rangers. Their haircuts and the way they scanned the perimeter said military before they even flashed their credentials. "Sir, this is now a restricted site," one of them said. "We'll need you to leave." Daniel straightened. "I'm a relative of the pilot who flew this aircraft, Captain Ellie Reeves." The men exchanged a glance that was too brief to be casual. "We appreciate that, sir, but this is classified military property. You can contact the Air Force Historical Research Agency if you have questions." They ushered him back toward his truck without another word. By the time he started the engine, the men were stringing up yellow tape and unpacking crates of equipment. Driving away, Daniel's mind kept returning to the notebook in his pack. That night, at his kitchen table, he broke the wax seal. The first pages were routine maintenance logs in Ellie's handwriting, tight, slanted script he remembered from letters she'd written to his father during the war. But halfway through, the tone shifted. The entries became terse, references to special cargo and alternate flight corridor, mentions of coordinates in Nevada and New Mexico, nowhere near the Mojave test range. And on the final page before the ink stopped, "Flight order received from Harland directly. No tower record, no flight plan filed. Will radio if conditions allow. If this is what I think it is, God help us." Daniel sat back, the desert wind rattling his kitchen window. Ellie hadn't vanished on a mechanical test run. She'd been sent somewhere, off the books, without official oversight. And whatever it was, she hadn't expected to come back. The next morning, Daniel called the Air Force Historical Research Agency. He was transferred twice before a polite but firm voice told him, "Sir, the records you're requesting are classified under executive order. They are not available for public release." When he asked why, the line went dead. That evening, as he sorted the photographs and transcribed coordinates from Ellie's notebook, a text message pinged on his phone from an unlisted number. "Do not pursue this. Some accidents are best left alone." The coordinates in Ellie's notebook didn't match any standard flight corridors. Daniel double-checked them on an old aviation chart, tracing each point with a pencil. One set landed squarely in the Nevada desert, not far from a stretch of land known in Air Force slang as the Box, an area with no official name, no map markers, and an airspace designation so restricted it might as well have been surrounded by invisible walls. The second set sat in New Mexico, just east of a missile testing ground. The third? The third was stranger still, a barren patch of high desert between the two, miles from any known base or airfield. Daniel wasn't a conspiracy theorist. 25 years in uniform had taught him that most mysteries were just paperwork, politics, and miscommunication. But he'd also learned that every so often there was something real. He started with the Nevada coordinates. The closest town was a withering strip of buildings called Ashford Junction, population maybe 50. He booked a motel room under a different name, the kind of habit you pick up when you suspect someone might be watching. The first evening there, he drove as far as the posted "No Trespassing" signs. Beyond that, the road vanished into a blur of heat shimmer. The only signs of life were the distant glint of chain-link fence and the slow, circling arc of a white SUV on the far ridge. Daniel parked, stepped out, and held a pair of binoculars to his eyes. Even at that distance, he could see the vehicle was too clean, too new for a dusty mining road. It stopped. A door opened. Someone got out. Just a silhouette, but the way they lifted their own binoculars made his stomach knot. They were watching him back. That night, the motel phone rang at 2:13 a.m. The voice on the other end was low, male, and precise. "Mr. Reeves, you've made your point. Go home." "Who is this?" Daniel asked. A pause. "Someone who knows your aunt's story doesn't end well." The line went dead. By morning, his truck had a fresh layer of dust on it, except for the driver's door handle, which was spotless. He drove to the New Mexico location next. The coordinates brought him to a dry wash bordered by jagged red rock. On the third ridge over, he found a scatter of metal shards embedded in the dirt, most so weathered they crumbled at the touch. But one piece, a warped rectangle with stenciled numbers, still bore paint. It matched the internal component labeling for the same jet model Ellie had flown. Daniel photographed the find, careful not to pocket it. If the Air Force was tracking him, and after the motel call he was sure they were, it would be better to have proof without physically possessing restricted material. Back in Tucson, he reached out to an old contact, retired Master Sergeant Ruth Callahan. Ruth had spent the last years of her career in Air Force records at Wright-Patterson and had an encyclopedic memory for anything unusual that crossed her desk. When he mentioned Ellie's name, Ruth was silent for a long beat. "I remember that case," she said finally. "Or, at least, I remember the absence of it." "What do you mean?" "Some accidents leave a paper trail. This one had holes, flight logs missing pages, maintenance records with altered dates, a base operations roster that didn't list Major Harlan the week she disappeared, even though I've seen his signature on documents from that exact week." "You think it was deliberate?" "I think someone went to a lot of trouble to make it look like your aunt's last flight was routine. And if you're smart, Danny, you'll stop looking before you find out why." He heard the worry in her voice, not the vague, polite kind, but the bone-deep kind you hear from someone who's seen careers and lives ruined for asking the wrong questions. But it was too late for Daniel to stop. That night, he spread the photographs from the crash site, the New Mexico metal fragment, and Ellie's notebook across his dining table. He marked each location on a fresh map. The three coordinates formed an irregular triangle. In the exact center of that triangle sat a square of land with no owner listed in the county registry. No roads in, no structures visible on aerial photos, just flat desert, its boundaries perfectly aligned to magnetic north. The next morning he drove out. There were no fences, no signs, just a change in the dirt where graded land met untouched scrub. He walked half a mile in before he saw them, 4 metal posts, each no taller than his knee, set in a perfect square about 30 feet across. They looked like survey markers, but when he brushed away the sand from the nearest one, he found a brass plate bolted to the top, engraved with a string of numbers, and one word: restricted. Daniel snapped photos, turned back toward his truck, and froze. A man was standing beside it. Black ball cap, mirrored sunglasses, civilian clothes that somehow still read government issue. "Long way from town," the man said. His tone was casual, but his stance was squared, solid. "Just passing through," Daniel replied. The man smiled faintly. Passing through is one thing, poking around is another. He stepped closer, and in that dry, empty air, his voice carried. "Captain Reeves took off from the Mojave on January 17th, 1949. She didn't come back. That's all anyone needs to know." Daniel didn't answer. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Enjoy your drive back." When Daniel got home, a new envelope sat on his porch. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a single photograph, the brass survey marker he'd just found, with the word "Restricted" circled in red ink. Beneath it, in block letters, "We know where you've been." Daniel knew from his years in uniform that if you wanted to get past the front door of a military secret, you didn't go through it. You looked for the people who had once been standing nearby. Major Richard Harland had been base operations officer at the Mojave Air Test Range in 1949, the man who'd handed Ellie her sealed orders. On paper, Harland's career had been unremarkable, a steady climb through operations and logistics, a transfer to the Pentagon in the mid-1950s, and a quiet retirement in '62. But as Daniel combed through old base, newsletters archived at the San Bernardino Historical Society, one photo stopped him cold. A grainy black and white image showed Harland standing beside a covered object on the flight line. A long, tarpaulin-wrapped shape the size of a small aircraft, guarded by 2 airmen. In the caption, Harland was described as overseeing classified cargo transfer to Nevada. The date? January 16th, 1949, the day before Ellie's last flight. Daniel printed the photo and slipped it into a folder with Ellie's notebook. Back in Tucson, he called Ruth Callahan again. "Ruth, you ever hear of something called Project Cerulean?" The pause on the line was long enough to make him think the call had dropped. "Where did you hear that name?" "It's mentioned in some old records tied to Harland, and there's a notation in Ellie's notebook. Cerulean drop. That mean anything to you?" "I've seen it exactly twice. Once on a requisition order with half the text blacked out, and once on a clearance roster from the late 40s that had maybe a dozen names, all high clearance, all gone within a few years." Gone? Transfer, early retirement, or dead. Danny, Cerulean was one of those words you didn't say out loud, even inside a skiff. I don't know what it was, but if your aunt was flying something connected to it, that's why you're getting attention now. That evening, Daniel drove to see a man named Gordon Bishop, a former base security officer who'd been stationed in Nevada in the early 1950s. Bishop lived in a quiet retirement community, the kind where conversations were usually about grandkids and golf. But when Daniel mentioned Harland's name, Bishop's demeanor changed. "Harland? Yeah, I knew him. Kept his cards close. Too close. He came through our installation twice, both times with sealed containers loaded onto flatbeds. No manifests, no serial numbers, just signatures. Always left with a plane escort." "You know what was inside?" Bishop shook his head. "Didn't want to, but I remember one of my men saying the containers were unusually light for their size. Could have been hollow. Could have been something not meant to be opened on the ground." "Why would a test pilot be flying one?" "That's the thing. You wouldn't put a high-value item in a bird unless you wanted it somewhere fast and without customs paperwork. And you sure wouldn't pick a woman in '49 unless you didn't want anyone to guess the real mission. Sexist thinking worked to their advantage back then." Daniel left Bishop's house with a knot in his stomach. The narrative was shifting. Ellie might not have been testing a jet at all. She might have been a courier for whatever Cerulean was, and if so, her disappearance might have been less an accident and more a disposal. The next day, while running a search for declassified documents on a public terminal at the University of Arizona Library, Daniel spotted a man loitering in the computer lab. Same mirrored sunglasses, same squared stance as the one by his truck in the desert. Daniel signed out and walked past him without looking up. On the windshield of his car, under the wiper blade, was a note. "Harlan's not your problem. Walk away. No signature. No fingerprint smudges." That night he scanned Harlan's old personnel file again. One section had always seemed like filler, a list of commendations from late 1948 to early 1949. Buried halfway down the list was an entry. Special Service Citation. Coordination with Civilian Contract Flight, Nevada Test Site. It clicked. Ellie had written no tower record in her notebook. If she'd flown out of range and landed on a civilian-registered strip used by military contractors, there'd be no official Air Force flight log. She could have been anywhere, doing anything before taking off again, maybe never heading back to Mojave at all. The coordinates, the strange brass markers, the sealed containers, they all pointed to a triangle of land that was as invisible on paper as Project Cerulean. Daniel decided to test a hunch. He sent the Nevada coordinates from Ellie's notebook to a friend in civil engineering who sometimes bid on government surveying contracts. The reply came an hour later. "That parcel is technically unassigned federal land, but the Bureau of Reclamation has a record of temporary lease to the Atomic Energy Commission from 1948 to 1950 0. No details listed." The Atomic Energy Commission. That would explain the secrecy and the absence of public maps. The following morning, Daniel's doorbell rang. On his porch stood a woman in her 60s with cropped silver hair, civilian clothes, and the bearing of someone who'd worn a uniform most of her life. "You're Daniel Reeves," she said. "Yes." "I knew your aunt. Flew with her once, in '48, before she went on that last run. Name's Colonel Margaret Dawson, USAF, retired. I heard you've been asking questions." Daniel hesitated. "Depends who you heard it from." "From someone who still owes me a favor in base security. You're making noise in places where the walls have ears." She stepped closer. "Ellie's last flight wasn't a test. It was a transfer, personnel and cargo. And the people who ordered it have been dead for decades, but the project they were part of is still classified. You push too hard, you'll find yourself in more trouble than you can manage." Daniel studied her face. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Ellie saved my hide in '48 when my own test went sideways. I owed her then. I owe her now. But this is as far as I go. Find out what Cerulean was, and you'll find out why she never came back." Dawson handed him a slip of paper with a single name. Dr. Alan Vickers, retired physicist, Livermore, California. He worked with the commission in '49. If he's still alive, he's the only one left who might talk. But be careful. If they know you've made the connection. She let the sentence hang. As she walked away, Daniel felt the weight of the note in his hand. This was the first direct lead from someone who had actually known Ellie, and it pointed straight at the people who had invented secrets for a living. That night, sitting in the dark with Ellie's notebook open in front of him, Daniel underlined her final entry again. "If this is what I think it is, God help us." For the first time, he wondered if the thing she feared wasn't in the sky, but already on the ground, waiting for her when she landed. Dr. Alan Vickers lived in a weathered ranch house on the outskirts of Livermore, the kind of place where weeds had claimed the gravel drive and the blinds stayed drawn even at noon. His name was still listed in the phone directory, probably because no one looking for him would think to check something so ordinary. Daniel parked across the street and watched for 15 minutes. No movement. Finally, he stepped out, walked up the porch, and knocked. A muffled voice came from inside. "If you're selling anything, I'm not interested." "I'm not selling. My name's Daniel Reeves. I'm trying to find out what happened to my aunt, Captain Eleanor Reeves. She flew for the Air Force in '49. Silence. Then the click of a lock. The man who opened the door was in his late 80s, stooped but sharp-eyed. He studied Daniel for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in, quickly." Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and machine oil. Books and file boxes were stacked in careful rows, each labeled in block letters. A faded black and white photo sat on the mantel, a group of men in lab coats standing beside what looked like a squat, finless rocket. "Cerulean," Daniel said quietly, nodding at the photo. Vickers's head turned sharply. "Who told you that name?" "A retired colonel, Margaret Dawson. She said you were there." "I was," Vickers said, sinking into an armchair. "I was a junior physicist with the Atomic Energy Commission in late '48. Cerulean was, well, officially it was a materials transport experiment. Unofficially, it was an attempt to test a portable containment system for fissile material." Daniel frowned. "Nuclear?" "Yes and no. The container was designed to shield against detection, so you could move sensitive cargo without triggering monitoring stations. The idea was to be able to transfer highly classified material without announcing it to the world." "And Ellie?" "Your aunt was one of the few pilots trusted to move classified payloads without question. Most didn't know what they were carrying. That was the point. Plausible deniability. She was scheduled to fly one of the first real-world tests of the containment system, from Mojave to a location in Nevada, with a stopover at a civilian airstrip we V1 used for handoffs." Vickers rubbed his forehead. "But something went wrong. I wasn't at the site, but the logs I saw later didn't make sense. The flight path recorded by the tracking station didn't match the official report, and the landing strip manifest, the civilian one, was pulled from the file entirely." "Why?" "Because, Mr. Reeves, there's reason to believe the payload she was carrying never made it to its destination." Daniel leaned forward. "Are you saying she was intercepted?" "I'm saying someone may have taken the cargo between Mojave and Nevada, and removing her from the equation was the simplest way to make sure no questions were asked." The words landed like a physical blow. Vickers stood, crossed the room, and pulled a slim folder from one of the stacks. He hesitated, then handed it over. Inside were photocopies of a memo dated January 20th, 1949, 3 days after Ellie vanished. It was addressed to Major Richard Harland, Mojave ATB Operations, marked EYESONLY SUBJ CERULEAN TRANS FER INCIDENTREPOR. T cargo unaccounted for. Pilot listed as missing, presumed dead. Recommend all further operations suspended pending review. Do not initiate recovery efforts until instructed by Washington. Secure all logs and restrict dissemination to need to know. In the corner was a handwritten note in pencil. Order came down faster than protocol allows. Somebody knew before the report was filed. Daniel looked up. "Where did you get this?" "From a friend in logistics who died in '72. He told me to keep it hidden. You're the first person I've shown it to in 30 years. They were interrupted by a sound outside, the low crunch of tires on gravel. Vickers moved to the window, then stiffened. "White sedan, government plates." Daniel felt his pulse spike. "Do they watch you?" "Not regularly, only when something stirs up the past." Vickers shoved the folder into Daniel's hands. "Go out the back. Don't come here again." "I can't just go." Daniel slipped out the rear door into a narrow alley between overgrown fences. He circled 2 blocks before heading back to his truck. From half a block away, he saw the white sedan still idling in front of Vickers's house. 2 men in suits were at the door. Daniel didn't wait to see more. He drove south toward Bakersfield, his mind racing. He had proof now, a direct link between Harland, Cerulean, and orders from higher up to bury the incident. That night, in a motel off Highway 99, he spread the memo, Ellie's notebook, and the Nevada-New Mexico coordinate maps across the bed. Together, they painted a picture no routine test flight could explain. Classified cargo loaded under Harland's supervision the day before the flight. A landing strip manifest erased from civilian records. Orders to halt recovery before it began. But the most chilling detail was that penciled note. Somebody knew before the report was filed. It meant Ellie's disappearance wasn't an accident or even a botched mission. It was anticipated. Daniel's first instinct was to get the memo and Ellie's notebook into hands that could compel action, someone with enough authority to demand records, but not so deep in the system that they'd be bound to bury it. He thought of Colonel Janet Hollister, now heading the Air Force Historical Records Review Board. Years earlier, she'd been a captain on the same base where Daniel served. He trusted her then. She'd been blunt, fair, and willing to tell uncomfortable truths. He called her direct line from a prepaid phone. "Ellie Reeves," she said after a moment, her voice both surprised and wary. "You're a long way from the last time I saw you. What's going on?" "I need a secure conversation. Not here. Not on this line." She agreed to meet in a diner just outside of Edwards Air Force Base, in a corner booth where the hum of conversations covered theirs. Daniel slid the photocopied memo across the table. Hollister's eyes moved quickly over the page. She didn't touch her coffee. "Where did you get this?" "From a man who worked Cerulean, Alan Vickers. He's in Livermore." Her eyes flicked up. "Was?" Daniel's stomach sank. "What do you mean, was?" "Local PD found him this morning. Apparent fall down his basement stairs." She leaned in. "Do you believe that?" "No." "Neither do I. But if you brought this to me, you've already painted a target on your back." Daniel pushed the notebook toward her. Ellie's own words, last page. She knew something was off. Coordinates, unlogged landing, and now a memo saying they were told not to recover her or the cargo. Hollister closed the notebook carefully, like it might shatter. "You think I can just march into archives and pull the file? Cerulean isn't in the declassified index. The people who can unlock it aren't historians. They're in the other building, the one with no windows." "Then tell me what you know." Her hesitation was long enough for him to think she'd refuse. Finally, "There's a classification called Continuing Operational Relevance. It means a file from 1949 can still be sealed today if its contents touch on methods or technologies that are either still in use or have been adapted for current programs. I've only seen it used a handful of times. Cerulean is one of them." Daniel exhaled slowly. "So it's not just history. It's alive. Alive and protected. And if Vickers is dead, someone's sending a message." She slid the folder back to him. "Danny, take this and leave California. You can't kick at this without it kicking back harder." But Daniel had already decided. "If I walk away, Ellie stays a line in a telegram." "I can't do that." Hollister's jaw tightened. "Then at least be smart. There's one more person who might talk if he's still breathing. Name's Raymond Cho. He was Harlan's adjutant at Mojave. Retired as a lieutenant colonel in '65. Last I heard, he was in Santa Fe." Before he could thank her, Hollister's eyes shifted over his shoulder. "Two men just walked in. Suits, not locals." Daniel didn't look back. He stuffed the documents into his bag, slid out of the booth, and left through the kitchen. By the time he hit the highway, a black SUV had pulled out a block behind him. It stayed there for 30 miles. He checked into a roadside inn under another alias and slept in fits, the SUV still in his mind's rear view. At dawn, he headed for Santa Fe. Cho's address turned out to be a low adobe house at the end of a quiet street. The man who opened the door was in his 90s, thin but sharp-faced, with eyes that pinned Daniel in place. "You're Reeves," he said. "I've been expecting you." Daniel stepped inside, startled. "How?" "Word travels. Hollister called. Said you have something of Ellie's." Daniel set the notebook on the table. Cho ran his hand over the worn leather like it was a relic. "She was the best stick on that base. Harlan knew it. That's why he picked her. And that's why she didn't come back." "What was Cerulean really?" Cho's voice dropped. "A proof of concept for moving something so dangerous no one would admit it existed. And not just nuclear. Think unconventional payload. Portable, game-changing, too valuable for one side to control." Daniel felt the pieces locking into a darker shape. And someone wanted it for themselves. Not someone. Several someones. Harlan's orders came from D.C., but I always suspected he was working both sides of the table. Cho leaned closer. The day Ellie vanished, a secondary flight plan was filed under a civilian charter company. Same route, same day, 2 hours later. That's the one you should be looking at. Do you have proof? Cho's gaze shifted toward a locked filing cabinet. I did. Not here. In a safety deposit box. Santa Fe Trust, downtown. But if you go for it, you'll be watched before you hit the door. As if on cue, there was a knock at the front door. 3 sharp raps. Cho's face drained of color. Back door, now! Daniel grabbed the notebook, slipped out into the narrow alley, and didn't look back. From the corner, he saw 2 figures in suits enter Cho's house without waiting for him to answer. Back at his motel, Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of it hitting him. 2 men who'd touched Cerulean, Vickers and now Cho, had been silenced or were about to be. The SUV, the phone warnings, the untouched safety deposit box that might hold the one piece of proof tying Harlan, the cargo, and Ellie's disappearance into a single undeniable chain. And the people who'd kept it buried for 50 years were still very much on the job. Santa Fe Trust looked like every other regional bank downtown. Marble floor, brass railings, muted carpet that swallowed your footsteps. But the way the guard by the elevator clocked Daniel as he came through the door told him they'd been tipped. He kept his pace casual, signed in for box access, and followed the clerk down to the vault level. The room smelled of metal and polish. Rows of boxes lined the walls, each with twin key slots. Number 417, Daniel said, sliding his ID across. The clerk hesitated. 1 moment. She stepped into a back office. When she returned, a second man was with her, older, banker's suit, smile that didn't touch his eyes. Mr. Reeves, he said, you've had a busy few days. Daniel didn't reply. The man unlocked the box, set it on a small table in a private booth, and stepped back. We'll be right outside. Inside the box was a manila envelope bound with string, the handwriting on the label instantly recognizable from Ellie's flight logs. Transfer, Jan 17, 1949. His hands shook as he untied it. The first item was a carbon copy of a civilian flight manifest, the secondary charter Cho had mentioned. It listed a twin-engine Beechcraft registered to Western Aero Freight, departing Mojave 2 hours after Ellie's scheduled takeoff, bound for the same coordinates in Nevada. The pilot's name was blacked out. The cargo line simply read, Container, sealed. Next was a faded black and white photograph. Ellie on the Mojave flight line, helmet under her arm, standing beside Harlan, and a tall civilian in a long coat. On the edge of the photo, in pencil, not on roster. The last item was a memo, this one not a copy, but the original, with Harlan's signature in blue ink. It was a routing slip for the Cerulean cargo, directing it to be transferred mid-route to secondary carrier for delivery to an alternate secure facility. Under destination, in cramped handwriting, Paloma Dry Lake. Daniel froze. Paloma was the 3rd coordinate in Ellie's notebook, the one in the middle of nowhere. It meant she'd never been meant to reach Nevada. The plan all along was for her to hand off the container in the desert, far from any recorded airfield, to someone not in the Air Force chain of command. And if she'd realized mid-flight that her orders had nothing to do with testing a jet, that cargo might be going somewhere it wasn't supposed to. Daniel pictured her banking away from the rendezvous, climbing to altitude, deciding to take the container back to base instead of completing the handoff. Someone had stopped her before she could. A shadow fell across the booth. Daniel looked up to see 2 men in suits standing in the doorway. The banker was gone. You've seen enough, one of them said. Daniel slid the envelope into his jacket and stood. If you were going to stop me, you'd have done it before I opened the box. The Babar man's smile was tight. We're giving you a choice. Walk out of here, hand over what you found, and you get to keep breathing. Or "Or I end up like Vickers," Daniel said. The other man's eyes didn't change. Daniel stepped past them, envelope under his arm, and didn't look back until he was in the sunlight. Across the street, a woman in a jean jacket with a camera at her hip was pretending to photograph the plaza. He recognized her, freelance investigative journalist he'd crossed paths with years earlier on a military history piece. He walked over. "Got something you want to see?" he asked. Her expression shifted from bored to sharp in a heartbeat. "What is it?" "The reason my aunt never came back from her last flight, and the reason some very dangerous people still don't want anyone to know why." They sat in a cafe 2 blocks away. Daniel laid out the manifest, the photo, the Harlan memo. As she read, he told her about the coordinates, the notebook, the men at Vickers's house. Chose warning. She whistled low. "If this is real, and it looks real, you're talking about an unauthorized transfer of nuclear-adjacent material, handed off to a civilian carrier with no oversight, hidden under a test flight cover story. And your aunt either figured it out or refused to play along." "She never made it to the drop point," Daniel said. Crash site was almost 50 miles off the official path. She was trying to bring it back. The journalist leaned back. "You want this public?" "I want the truth on record before they can make me disappear." "Then we don't go to one outlet," she said. "We go to 5. Simultaneous release. If they kill the story in one place, it still runs in 4 others. And we don't sit on it. We move now." The next 36 hours were a blur. Encrypted file transfers, calls to editors, scanned documents zipped and sent across continents. Daniel didn't go back to his motel. The journalist shuffled him between safe apartments owned by friends who owed her favors. By the second night, whispers were already hitting fringe sites online. A Cold War-era nuclear transport program, a missing Air Force pilot, new evidence in a 50-year-old disappearance. On the morning of the 3rd day, the stories hit. The Guardian, Le Monde, Sydney Morning Herald, Toronto Star, Denver Post. The manifest, the photo, the memo, all high resolution, all authenticated by independent document examiners. The headlines varied, but the thrust was the same. New evidence suggests 1949 disappearance of Air Force, test pilot tied to covert nuclear transfer. Within hours, Daniel's phone lit up with calls from reporters, veterans, relatives of other pilots who'd vanished under routine circumstances. But the message that stopped him came from Colonel Hollister. "You got it out. They can't put it back in. Stay out of sight. You won't get a second chance." He powered the phone off. That evening, alone in a borrowed apartment, Daniel sat at the window watching the lights of the city come on. Somewhere out there, men like Harlan had passed their secrets down to a new generation, still guarding whatever was inside that container. Ellie had died trying to keep it from going where it wasn't supposed to go. For 50 years, they'd written her off as an accident. Not anymore. He pictured her in the cockpit, seeing the drop point ahead, making her choice. And he understood now. It wasn't just about cargo. It was about who she was. And now, finally, the world knew it too.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.